Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of today's webinars is remote learning, and obviously the role of governance is seeking assurance that it is actually fit for purpose, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. For those of you who've not perhaps experienced this platform before, if you haven't already located the go-to toolbar, you should be able to find a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it floating around in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, it will actually allow you to view the toolbar, and you'll see on there that you've got little document icons. If you haven't already done so, you can download a copy of the slides that we're going to be sharing with you this morning. You will also see the word questions in a grey box with white copy in it. If you have any question or any comment at any stage during the webinar this morning, please do click on that, type your question in, and it will magically appear in front of us, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to it for you. And last but by no means least, hopefully you can all see that little hand icon. Just by way of a sound test, if you can hear me okay, could you just click on that hand icon now? Lovely. I can see lots of people clearly finger on the trigger waiting for that to happen. That's fantastic. Great. So we'll assume everybody can hear, because virtually all of you have put your hands up, which is good. So I'll just put your hands back down for you now, which is lovely. And with no further ado, we will actually kick off. I'm Steve Barker. I'm the person on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning. Morning, Linda.
Good morning.
And Linda and I are here on behalf of Better Governor today, and we're delivering this webinar in partnership with Governors for Schools. So the objectives of the session today are, hopefully what we want to do is actually clarify what that oversight that I mentioned a few moments ago of remote learning from a governance board perspective ought to actually look like. And obviously we'll be thinking about what plans our schools do have in place, but again, please do remember this is not an operational role that we have as governors. This is very much about that strategic oversight. So it's not for us to police and for us to get involved in the myriad of details surrounding remote learning, but it is for us to have an overview of what it should look like, and therefore how we inform our questions at governing board meetings in terms of its effectiveness, etc. And part of that effectiveness, of course, is dictated to a certain extent by the expectations that the Department for Education has, and so we'll be focusing on those as we go through the session this morning. And then hopefully as we go through, we'll be giving you plenty of pointers on the sort of questions that we believe are appropriate to be asking at this current time, most certainly, but as we move forward as well. So as I say, just a reminder, this is your session, so please do ask questions and keep your comments coming. We have got an awful lot of people on the webinar this morning, which is lovely, so please don't take that as a criticism. If we don't get to answer all questions, what we will do is get back to you individually afterwards. And if I'm not able to give you credit for your question, it's only because I'm actually grouping a lot of similarly themed questions together. Okay, so let's just kick off. And firstly, I think it's actually worth thinking about, what do we mean by remote learning? Is it new? Is it something that's just happened as a response to COVID, or is this perhaps something more of a continuum that schools have perhaps been thinking about for quite some time, and perhaps COVID and the resultant school lockdowns and partial reopenings, etc., and obviously the threat of further localized lockdown now has maybe acted as a little bit of a catalyst for schools to perhaps up the ante a little bit. Well, for us, it's probably a combination of all of those things, I think it's fair to say. And certainly from the Department for Education's perspective, and I have no doubt that every single one of you on this webinar this morning will be very painfully aware that the Department for Education has issued copious amounts of guidance over the last 6 months, and it is updated, it seems, on a very regular basis. And sometimes in sort of quite extensive detail as well. We've got the return to schools guidance, which is probably the most significant part of guidance, and we're going to be dipping in and out of that as we go through the session this morning. But just in case you're not aware, there is a separate document called Teaching During Coronavirus, and that again is one that's updated on a fairly regular basis. Hopefully you can see on the left-hand screenshot that I've got on my slide at the moment that it was last updated only last week on the 25th of September. And quoting sorry, Linda.
I would just emphasise what you said earlier there, Steve, that the teaching guidance is a much more operational guidance document, and it is that specific practical information. It is worthwhile as board members understanding that there is a range of things to support both the wider issue that we ensure as board members, but also some of the specific operational issues for schools. So the government are thinking on both those levels, but there is a lot of guidance being issued.
Absolutely, and as I say, I'm sorry, we will probably keep reminding you of this as we go through the session this morning, but this is what we're sharing with you here is what the expectations are, so that from a governance perspective, we are able to have that oversight of what should be in place. It's not for us to become experts in terms of the delivery, as Linda said, or in terms of the full content of some of the guidance that is actually out there. So you can see here, and again, I've been selective in what we've actually picked out here, but this is talking about the situation at the moment, or situations, I should say, where perhaps there could be pupils who are asked to remain at home. So we're talking about either classes, groups, or small numbers, where there is a requirement to actually self-isolate, or as is the case in certain areas of the country at the moment, and you can't put on a news broadcast right now without hearing about this, there are local restrictions in place, and at some stage that may require pupils to remain at home either in whole year groups on a rotational basis, and as far as secondary schools are concerned, or we could, if things got really bad, revert to a complete lockdown where schools are only open for vulnerable children and children of key workers. Again, I think everybody can't lose sight of the fact the government is emphatic, to say the least, at the moment. Schools will be the last thing that they shut. Lots of data, even on yesterday's broadcast, to say that school children are actually, well, certainly school children under the age of 15, are the group with the lowest incidence of infection rates at the moment. And obviously there is a bigger imperative in terms of the continuation of education for all their children and young people. So hopefully we will not get to what's called tier 4, but again, not going to go into the detail on all of those different criteria that the government will use to close schools, but many of our schools, and I think probably the most common element of remote learning being put into place, will be where bubbles or year groups are asked to isolate because there is either a confirmed case or in certain cases waiting test results because there's a suspected case. So at this stage, we thought it'd be helpful just to get a poll and just think about where you are as individual governors at the moment, and then we'll use that as a springboard to move forward for the rest of the webinar this morning. So, sorry, the poll's a little bit slow to go. It should be in front of you now. So the poll is asking what plans does your school have, or what plans you know your school has at this point in time in place for remote education. And you've got 4 choices there. If you could make your choice and vote now, we'd be very, very grateful. Just a reminder, if you've difficulty trying to vote, best thing to do is minimize your screen for a moment if you're in full screen mode, which most of us tend to be when we're watching webinars. Minimize the screen, that should free up the voting panel, and then as soon as you've voted, you can maximize your screen again. Just while we're doing that, we've got a question that's actually come in from Sue. Sue saying, how do schools support isolating children and manage teaching the class in school? This may overload teachers. Very good question, Sue. I think you're absolutely right. And I think as governors, we have to always focus on the fact that we have a duty of care for all staff in our schools, as well as our pupils. This is a challenge for schools at the moment, there's no doubt about that. Lots of teachers, and I speak as somebody who's actually married to a school teacher, have spent a lot of time over the summer holidays, a lot of time at weekends and evenings at the moment, making sure that they do have some remote learning ready to go at the drop of a hat. And you'll see on the next couple of slides what the expectations are in terms of the approach to that. But you're right, I mean, unfortunately it's a question that there's no perfect answer to it, Sue, but certainly we do need to be very mindful that there is an impact on staffing here. Okay, just under 90% of you have voted, so if you're going to vote, you've got another couple of moments to do that before we close the poll. As I say, if you can't vote, then just try minimizing your screen, and that should enable you to do so. Okay, there's a few more people voted there, so I'm going to close that poll now and then share those results with you, and they should come up anytime now. Right, there we go. So what we've got there is 46% of you saying that you do have a plan in place for remote learning should the need actually arise, which is good. 38% of you saying that we've already delivered some form of remote learning, which is great. 7% saying teachers will plan remote learning if it's required, and 9% of you saying at this point in time you're not sure. We would always put the caveat on this. If you say you don't know, it may be because you're a new governor, etc. But whether you're a new governor, whether you're a governor who's got a little bit of experience, if you don't know, it's a good question to ask, certainly at any forthcoming meetings that you have.
And I think looking at the number of people that have a plan in place, that's encouraging, because it's almost half of our audience this morning. So that demonstrates that the board have actually talked about this and shared information with you, which is fantastic. And of course, in some of the cases that Steve mentioned on the previous slide, in thinking about some of those children who may not have returned to school for some reason, I'm assuming that that is, or most of you, that second bullet point. But of course, there will be some of you, because we're covering a very wide area today, that may have had bubbles or groups of children who have had to self-isolate as a result of positive tests. And again, those children are entitled to their learning, and so you can see where those last two ones, teachers will plan remote learning if it's required, and I don't know, start then to have a greater impact on our governance in making sure that we understand what is required, because if we don't understand, we can't ask the questions to test whether the school is complying with its responsibilities and expectations.
No, indeed. Thanks, Linda. Okay, well, I'm going to hide that, or those poll results, I should say now, and move along. Got a couple of comments coming through from governors who are saying that their schools are already live streaming lessons for students at home, to ensure ongoing access. I think that, again, I don't know, there's a number of people have actually made that comment. I'm guessing that's probably more secondary than primary, although we're seeing a growing number of primary schools actually managing to access that kind of technology at the moment, but we'll say a little bit more about that later. Okay, so in terms of perhaps delving a little bit more deeply into the expectations the Department for Education has for us, there are two key expectations that have been articulated by the department in the last week or so. First one of those is that there is a recognition that a lot of schools, and again this may come back to those comments that have been posted on the question board in the last few moments or so about existing practice out there. DfE is acknowledging that yes, there was quite a lot of activity in the summer term in terms of schools supporting pupils through remote learning, and what the DfE is saying is that this should be a refinement, it should be an evolutionary model. So we expect schools, they expect schools to be continually reflecting on what they've learned as they move forward, and actually improving that existing offer that was put in place last term. And of course, The other consideration, which I'm guessing most of you will already be aware of, is that, again, the DfE's expectation was that all schools should have what they've described as a strong contingency plan in place by the end of September. And of course, yeah, happy 1st of October, that was actually yesterday. So irrespective of what we've said in response to that last poll, good idea to actually check. This should be on the agenda, I would suggest, for most governing body meetings that are actually coming up in the next few weeks, certainly before half term, because there is an expectation out there that this is where schools should be at this point in time. Now, that's not without its own problems and challenges, of course, but nonetheless, as governors, our responsibility is to hold our schools to account and to ensure that we do have appropriate measures in place. I think it's important to add here, this is not statutory, of course. This is actually, at this point in time, this is government guidance. And of course, enshrined in that guidance is actually the expectations that the DfE have of all schools. That said, there is always, as Boris Johnson said yesterday in the ministerial or prime ministerial broadcast, there is the opportunity to bring in legislation should they choose to. One would hope it wouldn't come to that here, but nonetheless, this is an expectation that relates to the needs of children and young people in our schools more than anything else. So hopefully it will be met with suitable responses in all of our schools. Okay, there's quite a few questions coming through which do relate to things we're going to say later on in the session. So if you think I'm ignoring your question, believe me, I'm not. It's just that we will come to that later on in the presentation, if that's okay with you. So some of the principles of contingency planning, as far as the DfE is concerned, is that when we talk about remote learning, remote for an awful lot of us in governance means using platforms such as this GoTo platform we're actually on this morning, or Microsoft Teams or Google Hangouts or any of those other proprietary products that are out there, but it's very much an online presence. The government is actually quite emphatic in actually stating remote learning can be online, of course it can, but it can also be offline. But it's actually part of our responsibility as those involved in governance, be it in multi-academy trusts, standalone trusts, or maintained schools, to ensure that our school has actually got curriculum resources out there to support pupils' learning in the event of either a mini lockdown or a class bubble closure, something like that.
And I think it's important to say here, Steve, that it should be linked to your school's curriculum, because with children returning to school, with a return to full-time education, then it is about not filling a gap and just giving a few worksheets, but it's about linking that to what would normally be being taught in that particular age group and stage of that child's school experience. So it's about that, how does it link back in with what the school had planned to deliver if children were physically there?
Absolutely. And of course, that links very neatly into that second bullet point, which is about high quality. There is no definition of high quality. I think some of the other bullet points here and a little bit more of the unpicking as we go through the webinar this morning may give us a little bit more of an insight as governors. But I think a good question for us as governors to pose in our schools is, well, what are the criteria which the school have set for putting in place what is regarded by them as a high quality remote learning experience for children and young people in our schools. Certainly the idea of the offering involving some kind of dynamic processes, and of course here interaction means interaction between the teacher and children and young people, assessment, in terms of teachers actually knowing and understanding where children and young people are in their learning. Have they grasped the subject? Have they actually managed to do the work that's actually been set for them? Are they fully engaged in, etc.? And also feedback on that. So the idea is, of course, that ultimately this has to be an iterative process that schools are expected. And I think certainly when we first found ourselves in lockdown back in March, schools were all, for the most part, issuing work to children and young people, but there weren't plans necessarily for that work to actually come back into schools. There wasn't any kind of formal assessment linked to it in place for an awful lot of our schools, and of course there will have been in some, but I think for the vast majority there wasn't. And also there wasn't necessarily the opportunity for schools to give feedback to children, and in some instances their parents and carers, of course, in terms of how well those children were progressing in their learning at that point in time. Now, we've had a couple of points made already on the question panel about the impact on staff. One or two have actually mentioned staff training. Yeah, absolutely. Staff CPD, continuous professional development, is crucial in this. And of course, one of the principles that the government is actually outlining in the approach it's actually extolling the virtues of to schools is the fact that this does depend on high quality CPD, because if staff are not trained, if there hasn't been a shared and discussed approach to how remote learning will work, and that might involve technology, and we're going to come on to that in a few moments. But if there hasn't been training, if there hasn't been a shared approach developed and discussed within schools, then obviously we're going to have a little bit of a piecemeal approach to this. It's not ideal for children, but again, that has an impact on the reputation of the school as well. Hard copies available is a reference to the first bullet point there about online and offline resources. Of course, there will still be families out there where perhaps they don't have access to what the school might be doing in an online mode. We know an awful lot of parents do have mobile phones, and that's the only way in which some children have been able to access any kind of remote learning until now. Yes, we know there's the government scheme rolling out in terms of provision of laptops and Wi-Fi hubs, etc., but that's at very, very early stages in a lot of parts of the country at the moment. Certainly, I'm actually based in Surrey myself, and I learned on Tuesday evening this week that Surrey had 1,200 laptops as part of this scheme to distribute to youngsters in schools. Now, I'm aware that we've got governors from all over the country at the moment, and you'll possibly be thinking, well, Surrey's not the most deprived part of the world. No, of course it isn't, but as with everywhere, there are pockets of deprivation, and 1,200 laptops doesn't even scratch the surface of the level of need, and I'm sure that will be the same to a greater or lesser extent in all other aspects of the country as well. So the idea is that schools have to be aware, and we'll come back to this point a little bit later, of who has, but more importantly, who has not got access to an online learning environment. And if they haven't, then hard copies of learning resources and learning tasks need to be available.
And we're not starting from a completely standing start here with schools. Much of this will have been practiced through the lockdown with the groups of children that weren't in school. So for many of these areas that we're talking about on this slide, schools will have found a way to make access for their children, it's very much context related, as available as possible, thinking about the needs of those individual children and those individual families. So I know, for example, in the two schools where I'm a governor, that there have been a lot of work around making technology available to some of those children who might not otherwise have had that. And that isn't always because that family is in some kind of disadvantaged area, but it may just be that there are a number of children and a limited number of computers and things available to them. So some of this has been practiced by your school already during lockdown. Some of it you will know about as a governor because you will have discussed some of these things in your meetings with your head teacher and senior team. Other areas you'll need to explore a little bit further just to ensure that you do have a solid understanding of what is happening on the ground in your school and that it is in line with these expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, part of those expectations, or the backdrop to those expectations, as Linda's implying there, comes from that learning from what we've done so far. And of course, one of the things that has become quite apparent, and again, this is very much an upward movement from schools, sometimes through teacher and head teacher unions and professional associations, etc. But With younger pupils particularly, certainly early years from Key Stage 1, but certainly not limited to those, but also specifically for groups of pupils such as those with special educational needs and disabilities, there is a need not just to make work available, but to actually think about how do we communicate, how do we work with and get an ongoing dialogue with the families of those youngsters, so that that can actually be scaffolded and put together in a way that actually makes work possible. Because of course, one of the big concerns of the last 6 months has been those pupils who are disadvantaged, and I don't mean in the traditional way, but disadvantaged either through their own needs or through family circumstances. The gap in their ability to make progress in their learning and all others has possibly widened. And so one of the things that the DFE is actually urging now is to get schools, or to urge schools, to actually think about the needs of individual pupils and groups of pupils and ensure that they are being supported at home if that's in fact where they are. And question here that's related to that from Olenka, and Olenka's saying, have the rules changed around children who are actually unwell around remote learning, so that if they are sick as opposed to self-isolating, are they still expected to access learning in the same way? No, I think again, you know, it's about working with parents, it's about schools, and certainly the schools where I'm a governor, I know that certainly head teachers in the primary schools and the secondary schools, the pastoral care team, if children are off ill for whatever reason, if they're just absent from school, there is an immediate phone call, there's an assessment of whether they are ill or whether there's another reason involved. And again, dependent on the type of illness. I mean, if they're isolating because they may have symptoms and they're waiting for diagnosis, then it depends how ill they are, but they may still be able to access. So I think a lot of this, in answer to your specific question, Olenka, is it's actually about a judgment call, a professional judgment call on behalf of the leadership in the school as to whether it's appropriate to provide work or not. And hopefully most responsible families, parents, carers, etc., they'll know whether their child's capable of work or not. And obviously the key message that schools want to get out is that any day missed from education is a day lost forever. So therefore we don't want, just because a child's staying off school at the moment because they've got a cold and it might be similar to symptoms of COVID, and of course there's a lot of that happening, we don't want them to be missing out on even more education. So no, rules on illness have not changed at all. Okay, let's move forward onto the next slide at that stage. So as far as the expectations on teaching is concerned, and again, these we are sharing with you not because we're necessarily saying these should be policed individually by governors, that's not our role at all, but just to give you a little bit of background information on what the government is saying to head teachers in terms of what the expectation should be that's in place in our schools. So as far as the work is concerned, as you can see by this first bullet point, this is about a fuller curriculum, and that was the point that was made earlier. So this is talking about a variety of different subjects being taught, very much in line with, if this is what you'd have got in school, the expectation is as near as is feasibly possible, that should be in place for remote learning as well. And whatever subject we're talking about, the work that's set for children and young people should be meaningful and ambitious. The meaningful, I would suggest, is interpreted as saying ties in with the existing curriculum that the school is on. So if the school were in session and pupils were all present, what would they be learning? That's what they should be learning where possible on a remote basis, and ambitious in terms of moving children forward. Now, we've had a few questions asked already about differentiation. Schools are expected to think about differentiation, but of course that's far more difficult, and again, age, need, phase that they're in, the stage of their learning they're at, all of those factors come into play here. But certainly the overall expectation is about building knowledge and skills for all pupils, but of course the ability to differentiate a lesson when it's actually being done remotely is somewhat impeded. Linda, when you and I were talking yesterday, you were talking about something that's happening in one of your schools in terms of using one of the learning platforms for differentiation. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, what has happened is as schools have returned, they've started looking at the way in which they'll do the catch-up work the recovery curriculum in their schools, and they've started looking at how they can draw different children in to different areas of that. So one of the schools, and it is a primary school, they've moved from one particular platform that they were using to interact with children to another, and this allows them to set a task with the class in real time. So welcome the children there, set them a task, let them get on with that piece of work, and remain with a small group for a differentiated working, more one-to-one, maybe a small group of 6, finish that task with them, and then welcome the rest of the class back into the whole session for a plenary. So clever use of, and this is, will relate to the staff CPD bullet point later on this slide, using what you've got that works well as a school. This particular school is part of a small MAT, so there's some learning across a range of schools, which often also helps. Feeding back what worked, and getting children's feedback about what they found helpful as well. I think there's a link here to some of the SEND stuff, because if a school has a policy of not welcoming visitors at the moment, and some of the visitors that will bring in specialist services for working with children with additional needs, they're maybe not back at full strength working with individual children, and not making home visits to some of the children in their homes again yet, making sure that you've got tasks that are suitable and interactive with those groups of children that maybe have lost the most learning because of the lockdown are going to be things that have to be factored in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we do need to actually think about is, are schools aware of their context, and the context in terms of what is actually out there? And that, because really that's what we should be responding to. And as governors, clearly equality should never be that far from our minds. So we should be asking those questions specifically about, does this mean that all pupils actually have access? Again, there's some pedagogical expectations coming in here, frequent clear expectations by the teacher. These are the sort of things that we would expect senior staff, school leadership to be monitoring. That's nothing that we as governors should be doing. And there is a little bit of an element of teaching teachers to suck eggs here, I think it's fair to say. Staff CPD comes up again, of course, in terms of are teachers aware of any technology that's using? Are they as up to speed as they need to be in terms of the curriculum? Because of course, don't forget, we've got newly qualified teachers, we've got teachers who are new to schools, having started in September. A lot of points have been made already, but inset days have had to be cancelled, or perhaps the training associated with inset days cancelled, because preparation time was given for getting the school fully ready to welcome children into school at the beginning of the new academic year. So yeah, very much a hiatus at the moment as far as CPD is concerned, but I think schools need to think long and hard about how that's actually being put in place. Is it being done through staff meetings? Again, the last thing we want to do is overload school teachers. That's not what this is about, but it's not fair to deprive teachers and other staff involved in pupils' learning of their own professional development, which enables them to ensure that this process of remote learning is as effective as it possibly can be. Again, another reference here to that idea that we are continually monitoring and reflecting on how things are going, and if changes are needed, then they are actually put in place. And the last one, which perhaps comes as a surprise to one or two people, daily teaching time equivalent to that in schools. Now, for most schools, that's going to be probably around the 5.5 hour mark. That's a tall order, of course it is for some people. We've got dozens of questions have come through about how do you reach the hard to reach, how do you actually make sure that people who don't engage do engage. Those are challenges, of course. There's the same kind of challenges, changed a little bit because of the situation we're in at the moment, but schools are constantly fighting that battle to try and engage parents who are not as engaged as we'd want them to be in their children's learning, those that don't actually participate in home learning, those that don't actively ensure that children are attending school on an ongoing basis. Those challenges are just manifesting themselves in slightly different ways, but the expectation, of course, is that schools are in regular communication, there's dialogue going on, and if necessary, schools will have to resort to using what used to be called educational welfare officers. They're sometimes called inclusion officers now, but talking to people who are responsible for that, because there is a statutory responsibility for school-aged children here, and there will be consequences for those that actually don't engage. It's not an easy one. It's not easy to police by schools at all, but it's something as governors, again, we perhaps ought to be asking questions about. Do we know, have we got a firm enough idea of the data around those who perhaps are not as engaging as effectively as we want them to?
And these are often the same group or many of the same group of children that before the school closures, we found were difficult to engage with anyway. So that's going to give them that extra dimension of, we're now back to routines and expectations, and we already have had a break from that. But there are also a link here with some of those children who may not have had a very positive school closure experience, and some new groups of children that fit in to that category. And schools, from a safeguarding point of view, have been very conscious of their responsibilities there and how they react to that and build that communication and understanding in order to re-engage or to engage with those families that they haven't had to work with in that way in the past.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide here. And again, now this does come back to a few of these questions we've possibly responded to already, but some of the practical considerations that schools will be facing, and I say considerations, challenges might be a more appropriate word, some of you may think, but all of these things are things to think about. And of course, I've got context in the first bullet point. These are all contextual to an extent, but what they ought to do, perhaps as thought provokers, is inform the questions we ask back in our governing body meetings at school. First and foremost, are we as aware as we need to be as governors of what the context of our school is in terms of those pupils? From an age perspective, how easy or difficult is it for them to access remote learning? And again, it's not just about how old those children are, it's at what stage are they in their learning, because as many of you will know, teachers are differentiating work in a variety of different ways on a daily basis across all lessons for a whole variety of children. As I say, my wife is a teacher. She teaches year 2. She has some children in her class who, despite missing 6 months, are already exceeding age-related expectations. In other words, they're already in 1st of October today where they would be expected to be in May, June next year. At the other end of the spectrum, she's got some who are still working towards a Key Stage 1 curriculum, and of course there's another group who are in a myriad of different places in between. That's one of the challenges of being a teacher, but as governors, we actually need to have an understanding, not on a pupil by pupil basis, but also, what sort of spread of ability have we got within year groups, within the school, etc., and how are we meeting those needs? Because of course many of us will have children with special educational needs and disabilities or other additional needs that mean they have additional support in class. That's not always going to be possible in a remote learning scenario. Have we thought about going back to building on the successes of the existing offer? Have we thought about how effective in our own individual schools what we did in the summer term was? Have we benchmarked that and actually said, okay, that's where we were, how can that be even better if? Do we know about how many pupils in our school do have appropriate technology and appropriate access to the internet? Have we audited that? Lots of questions have come up already in terms of the platform that the school is using. There are government schemes, and we're going to talk about those in just a few moments. But again, it's a detailed question. It doesn't actually matter to us which platform it is. What we should be doing, of course, from a governance perspective, is asking questions about have we researched it? Have we done an appropriate risk assessment to explore some of the risks associated with use of the internet, etc.? Don't forget that our safeguarding responsibilities do not go away, but these are whole school health and safety risks as well. So we do need to think about, this isn't just a decision, yes, we'll use Google, or yes, we'll use Microsoft, but have we done our research? Are we prepared for all eventualities? Again, keep coming back to staff CPD. That is a big question for us as governors, and I think that's something that we do have to think about. And again, linked to all those questions we've already had about the impact this is going to have on staff, we do need to think about, well, who is going to do the planning for this, and when are they going to have time to do it? One inset day, which we've already heard lots of schools have actually spent distributing hand sanitizing gel and making sure that their classrooms are all set up in terms of extra cleaning and sanitation, lost already. Where do we go in terms of giving teachers time? And there are only so many hours in the day, but when is this going to happen if it hasn't already? So again, those are just thought provokers, but prompts possibly for some questions which we might want to respond to. I want to move on now and just cover some of, now this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but just to make you aware from a governor perspective. And again, if these are all in the public domain, you can go and do your own research, you can have a look at some of these, but these are not areas of the work of our schools that as governors we are expected to be experts on. This is just so you have a little bit of background if you're not already aware of what's going on out there. In terms of support that is available to schools, this is primary only, but the government has actually funded what's called the Oak National Academy. And basically what this is a resource website. It contains resources for Year R, reception class, right the way up to Year 6 at the top end of Key Stage 2. And there are full lessons, online lessons, which can be streamed or downloaded on a whole range of subjects across the curriculum and for all year groups within that Year R to Year 6 range. Also, you'll find on there is a specific hub for parents and carers, giving advice to them in terms of how to support their child or children. There is a hub specifically for teachers, which has got lesson plans and ideas on how to actually develop some of the lesson themes, etc. And of course, above all else, it's free to access. It's been funded by central government and it is there as a resource. So coming back to that last bullet point on the previous slide, yes, this is putting pressure. This is actually adding to teacher workload, but there are some resources out there that hopefully mean the job is perhaps not as unmanageable as it might otherwise be. We've also got the platforms, and as we said before, this isn't all about online learning. There can be offline learning as well, but government has actually recognised that there is a challenge here. Most schools in this country were not set up for remote online learning before March this year, and therefore, again, another government-funded initiative is to make online learning platforms available to schools at no charge at all. Google for Education and Office 365, or it's very often referred to by government as Microsoft 365 for Education. In essence, they're one and the same thing, of course. But so two of the biggest providers in terms of online presence, Google and Microsoft, are in this government scheme. It's fully funded government access. There are certain criteria that have to be met, but schools for the most part will already hopefully have actually got this in place. Again, good question to ask if you don't know the answer, which platform your school is actually using, or did they already have their own? And part of the offer that's funded by government here is that there is user training available. It's all remote, of course, it would be, but there are plenty of lessons, and I know that again, forgive me, I keep talking about my own little bubble here, but my wife's school are using Google for Education, and I know that my wife has actually accessed several of the Google modules. A lot of them are American, but it doesn't matter. The content is still equally as valid and equally as relevant for the situation that we're in at the moment.
And I think these are things that the schools can consider. There's not a stick here that says you have to use this or you have to use that. Again, it's very much back to what has worked in your school so far. Do more of the things that work. What opportunities do some of these things afford? And is it right for your school? These are professional education judgments that the school is having to consider. Where does it fit with your staff learning, your availability to the internet, and your pupils' availability to a good signal? And it's about choices, therefore, that schools have to make, and proposals for the way forward that they would be putting before you as governors to consider or to understand the approach and why. And some of the questions that you will ask will increase your knowledge and understanding about why these proposals, this approach that the school is taking, is suitable for your school, your pupils, your staff. But there are lots of things to consider here. This is just giving you an idea of what has been made available, and what we have continued to say with any of these sessions around life not as it was before the pandemic is about making choices that are related to your context. Context is everything. There isn't one size fits all approach.
And I think that links quite neatly into a question that's come in here from Jeff, and there's a similar one has come in. Sorry, questions are coming in fast and furious, and it's spinning around like a one-armed bandit. From Rob, sorry. Questions about the extent to which schools are engaging. I think from a governor's perspective, we can ask, it's helpful background. This is not for us to direct. As Linda says, this is about professional judgment. So the extent to which schools use these online platforms and use resources produced by the Oak Academy, or are using bite size or other approaches, there's a whole myriad of them out there. But yeah, there is an amount of inefficiency, of course, about everybody recreating their own wheel or reinventing their own wheel here. But don't forget that this is actually what teachers are doing on an ongoing basis. Some will buy into proprietary schemes or use platforms, etc., to craft their lessons, but they'll always be adapting them to meet the needs of their individual pupils, and that's the expectation. So I think as governors, as Lynn says, we should not have an expectation that it should be done in a particular way, but certainly in terms of our own interest here, it would be helpful to ask the question and just know, but actually to understand the rationale behind that, of course.
And if you're not doing it something a particular way, but have chosen to do it a different way, what is the impact of that going to be? Because as a governing board, we are still all about testing. Has it worked? Is it working? What tells us that this is having the right impact or is likely to have the right impact? Those are the kind of questions from a strategic point of view that we should focus our attention on as governors.
I think that's a very good point. Question here just before we move on, and I will talk to this slide that I've just put up in just a few moments, but Alexandra's asked a question here. She's saying that she's the Equality Link governor and she's unsure how to serve at this time. I was to go in and go through the books to serve diversity, but obviously can't because of COVID. Should my current focus be on accessibility of remote learning? I think that's a really good idea. I think all schools should be doing that. And yeah, don't just make it a static process, I would suggest, Alexander. Do the audit, but then ask the question, so what? And the so what question here is, so what are we going to do about it? If we find out that 25% of our children do not have remote access, what are we doing to satisfy their remote learning needs to ensure that they don't perhaps fall further behind than they might already be? So I think that's a really helpful question to put, and something we should all think about, because actually equality underpins everything that we've actually talked about this morning, really, in many ways, I would suggest. Okay, I just wanted to share with you this particular resource. Hopefully many of you will already be familiar with the Education Endowment Foundation. It's a charity that was formed out of the Sutton Trust almost 10 years ago now, and they have a whole wealth of resources on their website, a lot of them linked to supporting the learning of disadvantaged children, particularly around the use of pupil premium and the idea of closing the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and all others. They have produced a specific resource here, COVID-19 support guide for schools. Certainly worth asking the question. Again, we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail of as to what's actually within this. However, it's there, it's free to access resource, so if you're minded to actually find out more, you can certainly do that as a governor. But certainly for me, probably the biggest call to action on this is to actually go back to school and say, has anybody in school looked at this? Have we actually seen if there are any resources here? Because, whilst I said in response to the last but one question, teachers will always want to adapt, for the most part, the planning that perhaps they can find on the internet or find in schemes for schools purchased. If there are resources out there which can be adapted rather than starting from scratch, that's got to be in every school's interest, I would have thought. So certainly a valuable one to actually think about there, I would suggest. And some of the questions that, as governors, perhaps we might want to reflect on. Again, I'm not suggesting we've suggested lots of questions that you might want to take back to school. Please don't ask them all at the same time. That's not fair on anybody, least of all head teachers who are under the cosh quite significantly at the moment in terms of the amount of additional work that COVID is actually putting on schools. But certainly in our governing body meetings, these are things that we might want to think about. So if you don't know, we've already said about finding out what platforms being put in place. How quickly can remote learning happen? A few questions came up on this earlier, but I've left it till now. The government uses the word immediately. Now, define what immediately means. So if a class is sent home on a Friday because there's a suspected outbreak and they're told not to come in on Monday until whenever they're told to not come back until, the expectation is that remote learning is a little bit like a tap now, and you can turn that on as as quickly as you possibly can. Hence, today is the day when all schools are expected to have plans in place. The government gave us 4 weeks now. We know that teachers have actually been doing an awful lot of other things in that last 4 weeks, and schools will be at different places on that continuum of readiness. But again, the expectations are there. Schools should be in a place where, if they're not fully ready yet, they should be moving towards, and that's a perfectly reasonable question for governors to ask. We've talked about home access at the moment. We've talked about home engagement, and again, similar thing there, because again, this comes back to Alexandra's question, I believe, about equality here. Home engagement, this is about the equal chance or the unequal chance of all pupils having the support at home that the most advantaged pupils get. And of course, we know it's not an even playing field, but as governors, we need to be assured that our school is actually aware of that, but more importantly, the so what question, so what are we doing about it? We talked about ongoing assessment and feedback. Obviously that is monitoring, but how is the impact of the remote learning being monitored? How will teachers actually know which pupils are making progress in the learning, which aren't? How do they need to revisit it, etc. Teacher workload, we've talked about a lot, but are we asking enough questions in our governing body meetings about teacher workload? Is everybody having a shared responsibility here? Is this being done in year groups? Obviously, the bigger schools have got more teachers to perhaps share planning responsibilities, but if you're a governor in perhaps a one-form entry primary school, then the responsibility tends to fall on one person's shoulders and one person alone. So again, in those schools, in terms of helping perhaps reduce the impact on teacher workload and work-life balance, are schools using some of those resources that are available? And we've just given you a little snapshot. There's a myriad of different resources out there, lots of support groups on social media, etc. And we should be asking if our schools are actually using those as well. And last but by no means least on this list here, have we thought about, well, what if teachers get ill? There's lots of talk from government, of course, about keeping schools open, and the rationale for that is that children tend not to become ill. That doesn't apply to the adults that work with and support the learning of those children, of course. And that's something to think about as governors. Is there a contingency plan there? I don't know whether any of you have had any experience of supply teaching or getting hold of supply teachers at the moment, but a lot of people who have perhaps historically been available to do supply are a little bit reluctant to go into a variety of different schools at the moment. Sorry, did I cut you off there, Linda? I apologise.
No, I was just going to say in relation to remote learning, and this was something that in my board meeting earlier this week, we had a conversation around as a smaller school and the requirement with the remote learning offer to provide something that looks akin to full-time. If you've got teachers who are unwell themselves, their ability then to engage with that remote learning, despite having planned it well, has been compromised because they're actually not well enough to deliver. So what are the contingency plans if you have got a teacher, a number of teachers who in a local lockdown or in a positive case being confirmed are unavailable to deliver what has been planned? So again, there were no answers because of course at the moment that was a question that governors had asked, and the school is going to consider how that might best be accomplished. If it's one or two teachers, possibly much easier than if it's a greater number. But here we are saying there is no perfect way through this particular issue. We as schools are testing with our governors being able to do this as well as we possibly can, and the preparation and the planning will help us enormously in being able to do that as well as we can if and when the need arises. But we do need to be careful and cautious as governors when we are asking these questions, that we already have teachers and senior teams who are trying their very best to manage those children's needs as they return to school and assess what has been lost, whilst also being aware that at some moment in time they may be required to, on top of all of that work, also offer a remote learning opportunity. So there's a little bit of kindness that comes in here around these questions, but for the vast majority of schools, they will have done this piece of work in their planning for the reopening of schools, and it's about testing that we're on the same page as board members in understanding what has been planned and is being offered.
And I think another dimension, there's a question that's come in here from Lee. He's saying, can a staff member refuse to do remote learning? They don't have an internet connection at home, or they live in a remote area where the signal can be a little bit hit and miss. I think that's a very good question, Lee. I think we need to be mindful, of course, the teaching unions have taken their role is to actually look after the interests of their members, and certainly they would not want additional workload pressure put on teachers. But of course, if teachers are not in school because a bubble has been isolated, then it is not considered an unreasonable adaptation that they would be involved in remote learning from home. Now, whether that means that teachers would want to be live on screen with the potential that people, recording them for future use or abuse, etc. That's a different matter entirely, and that's where we, the comment about risk assessment earlier has actually got to be taken in mind. Lots of schools have said, well, okay, if we are doing live streaming of lessons, we would ask teachers, providing they are not required to isolate, to come into school and do it from school. But again, it's for individual schools to work through those. Again, teaching is a profession. We want it to be seen as being as professional as possible. We do need to think about a lot of the safeguarding issues, and also a lot of the perhaps self-preservation is a better way of describing issues for members of staff here. So very good question, Lee, and certainly something I would suggest you ask back in your governing body as well, just as a reassurance perspective. Okay, so we're getting very near the end of the session, folks, and we've still got quite a few questions actually on the board at the moment. So if there are any more, then please do send those through. We'll just pick one or two questions just before we end. But if there are some questions that you haven't answered, Linda and I will go through those and we'll respond to you with an email after the event, if that's okay. There was a question here. Yes, Elizabeth had a question. If research on platforms is required, that should be done nationally. We don't all have time to do it, surely. Good point, Elizabeth. I think the fact the government has actually invested in Microsoft and Google does tell us that they have actually done some kind of due diligence on this, of course. That having been said, the risk assessment is about our own setting. The risk assessment is about, well, how will we use this platform? Will we have teachers broadcasting from their bedrooms with perhaps personal items, personal photographs, etc. in the background? Yeah, those are risk assessment issues. Risk assessment is also about, if we are expecting children, sometimes very young children, to access the internet, are we actually making sure that that's safe from their perspective as well? So this is really about identifying risks and then thinking about how far they've already been thought about and mitigated by those platforms, and if not, what can be done at an individual school level. Lots of questions on Oak Academy. I don't really want to go into those. Lots of people saying, sorry, correcting me, they're saying Oak Academy is for secondary schools too. I do apologise. Clearly, I didn't find that bit when I was doing my own research. Jennifer's got an interesting question here, and I think we will make this the last question, I'm afraid. But Jennifer's saying some parents have asked for live teacher interaction in remote teaching. Should this be made available? I think it's an interesting question, Jennifer, and I think you're right. I've come across that question several times in a variety of schools in the last few weeks. There is a challenge, and I think not all parents, I'm a parent myself, so please don't think I'm being rude to parents here, but parents don't always appreciate the workload of teachers. My wife's school normally does a meet the teacher meeting in the first couple of weeks of term. Obviously, that's not possible at the moment. So every teacher in my wife's school, and I know this has been replicated in schools up and down the country, was phoning every parent or trying to phone every parent. Now, that process in itself for 30 children, that's a significant amount of work. You still have to teach children, you still have to plan their lessons, you still have to assess them, you still have to give feedback, etc. The number of expectations we can put on teachers, is finite, I would suggest. And I think as governors, we have to be asking the right questions of our schools and perhaps thinking, well, yes, this would be nice, but actually there are other things which sometimes are more important. Clearly there is a need for interaction, and as we made the point in one of the earlier slides, interaction and communication between teachers and parents, carers, in some instances is going to be vitally important. But there is a limit on availability and capacity to be able to do that in schools. So I don't think there is a blanket assumption that we can make. That would be my point. I don't know whether you'd have any other view on that, Linda.
No, I'd agree with that. And having supported a secondary school child that I'm related to during the school closure, I saw lots of examples the secondary school was trialling to engage with children, including emails and praise and encouragement feedback, using a variety of different ways of engaging those children. So I think it is really about what, in your context, your school has done, what has worked, and do as much of that as you can. What hasn't worked, ditch that and do the things that you think would add more value to your pupils' learning. But it's very much context and taking the human factor into account in what you do and how that works. We don't want teachers burning themselves out in trying to reach each of their children individually, even if they have the greatest will to want to do that. It simply isn't sustainable.
Indeed. I'm afraid time has eluded us, folks, so we're just to actually bring the session to a close. Slide there with references to all of the various publications and websites that we've talked about this morning, so that's there. And just to say thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure for Linda and myself in terms of bringing this webinar to you from Better Governor today on behalf of Governors for Schools, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you very much indeed for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.